You would think that, at 74, you stop caring what people say about you at dinner parties. But I've come to learn that silence doesn't mean you're invisible. Sometimes, it just means you're being watched more closely. The party was in full swing when I heard it. Not a whisper, not an insult slipped between teeth. No, it was a joke, a line tossed like a garnish on some overpriced appetizer. Even the help deserves a night off, Julia said, raising her Prosecco in the air with a polished grin. Everyone laughed. Shallow, polite, loud enough to drown the flicker of shock. I smiled too. I always do. I stood beside the kitchen archway, back straight, espresso cooling in my hand, my good loafers pressing into the imported tile. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and simply didn't care. That's what wealth does, or the illusion of it. It makes decency optional. I'd been living in this house since 1982, long before the new plaster moldings or the quartz chandelier. My husband Alessandro chose this place because the morning light hit the olive tree just right. He died in that light, heart failure at the sink, making his own espresso, refusing to let me grind the beans for him. We raised our son, Matteo, here. I made the ragu that won his school's charity cook-off. I mended his uniforms when he scuffed his knees, playing calcio in the piazza. And when he married Julia, I welcomed her into this home with the silver cutlery from my mother's hope chest. When Matteo asked if they could move in while saving for their own home, I said yes. Of course, family stays close. That was 8 years ago. Now Julia called me Nonna only when it suited the performance. Holiday toasts, social media captions, those filtered snapshots she uploaded where I always looked blurred or cropped. Tonight, though, there were no filters. Just barefaced cruelty. I heard her again from the terrace. She's still in the kitchen? Mamma mia, someone give her a break. We're not running a trattoria. More laughter, this time deeper, from men in linen suits and women who smelled of bergamot and banking power. I set my espresso down. Quietly, no clang. The marble countertop was cool beneath my fingers. My hands, veined and freckled, looked like my mother's now. Her hands, after shelling peas, after years of lighting candles in empty chapels. I pressed them down to stop the trembling. Julia's voice wafted in. Again. You know, we're thinking of modernizing the layout. Too many doors. Too many awkward spaces. She still uses the pantry like it's my pantry. The one I lined with glass jars after Alessandro passed, organizing every bean and grain like memory could be preserved in labels and lids. I didn't leave the kitchen. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the tiramisu tray. Julia had told me to arrange it, like in a boutique hotel, but homemade looking. I had rolled my eyes when she said it, but followed her instructions anyway. Tonight wasn't about fighting. It was about Matteo's potential business partners, the kind who didn't check bank accounts before investing in startup ideas. I carried the tray out. Julia saw me, and lit up like a sconce. Ah, dessert. Brought to you by the heart of the house herself. A few claps. A few amused nods. No one stood to help me place the tray. I moved slowly, not from age but because I refused to let my fingers tremble. As I set it down, Julia leaned in close, too close, and said under her breath, "Grazie, Nonna, you've always known your place." I looked her in the eyes, deep brown like espresso, with too much sugar. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, something inside me folded, not snapped, folded, like parchment before fire. I excused myself quietly and returned to the kitchen. The espresso was cold now. I poured it down the sink and watched the brown spiral drain away. Then I opened the drawer beside the stove, the one no one ever touched. Inside was a faded manila envelope. Property deed. Still in my name, fully. Julia had never asked. Matteo never checked. They assumed, like people always do with old women who bake well and keep their mouths shut. I closed the drawer and turned off the lights. The party outside continued. Tinkling glasses, muted jazz, the same 3 toasts repeated with louder slurs. From the window, I saw them all. The people who walked past my framed wedding photos in the hallway without once asking who the man beside me was. The people who thought olive oil came in gift bags and mothers came with mute buttons. I went upstairs to my room, the attic, technically, but I had turned it into a sanctuary, plants along the sill, a rug from Amalfi, and beside the lamp, my phone. I sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and dialed the lawyer's number. I kept saved under emergency Lucia. She answered on the second ring. Mrs. Romano, it's time, I said. Lucia didn't ask what I meant. She'd heard enough over the years. We'll file Monday, she said. Do you want to start with the eviction letters? Yes, I replied. And send copies to me directly. They're not just tenants, Lucia. They're uninvited guests who think they own the house. When I hung up, I didn't feel anger. Not even betrayal, just air. Clean air, the kind you breathe only after shutting a door that stayed open too long. Tomorrow, I'd serve breakfast, like always. I'd slice fruit. I'd listen to Julia talk about light fixtures, and when the courier knocked 2 days later, I'd let Matteo answer the door. But for now, I let myself sit. Not cry. Just sit. I picked up the cold espresso and took a slow sip. Bitter. Honest. For the first time in years, it tasted right. The next morning, the villa smelled like candied figs and lavender floor polish. I'd been up since 5. Habit. Or perhaps instinct, sharpening itself ahead of what would come. I pulled the shutters open just wide enough to let in the sun, but not the street noise. Via dell'Orso was starting to buzz. Delivery trucks, sweeping brooms, a barking dachshund. I used to like the hum of Rome, waking up. These days, it felt more like an alarm clock. I didn't ask for. Downstairs, the remnants of last night's party were still scattered across the terrazzo and dining room. Half-drunk spritzes, cheese knives in strange places, lipstick-stained napkins, abandoned like wilted flowers. Matteo and Julia hadn't even bothered to clean. Of course not. They assumed someone else would. Someone like me. Instead, I walked past it all, slippers soft against the tiles, heading to the mailbox outside the gate. My hands were bare in the early chill, but steady. I opened the rusted flap and found exactly what I'd asked for, a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside, 3 documents. One for Matteo, one for Julia, one for the record, all printed neatly on my lawyer's letterhead. I slipped them into the pocket of my cardigan and returned to the kitchen. By the time the house began to stir, first the toilet, flushing in the guest bathroom, then the clinking of spoons in the upstairs kitchenette, I was already back at the marble counter with my espresso warm again, in my hand. Julia descended first, barefoot and too loud for the hour. She wore one of Matteo's old university sweatshirts, the kind she styled with silk scarves and called effortlessly vintage. She barely glanced at me. Did you wash the stemless glasses yet? We need them for brunch later. I didn't answer. Just took a sip of espresso and turned a page in my newspaper. She blinked at me. Nana? I heard you, I said, folding the paper slowly. She tilted her head. Well? Well, what? Her nostrils flared. The glasses, Nana. Ah. No, I didn't wash them. I suppose the hostess can. She froze like a photograph in the wrong album. Excuse me. Your party. Your mess. I was a guest, remember? Her cheeks flushed. Not shame. Irritation. Before she could reply, Matteo came in, rubbing sleep from his eyes, hair flattened to one side like a careless boy. Morning, Mama, he said with that absent-minded kiss to the cheek he'd perfected over the years. Hey, babe, he added to Julia, who returned it with a quick look that said, we'll talk about this later. I picked up some mail for you, I said casually, retrieving the envelope from beside the stove. Oh? Matteo asked. I handed it to him. He flipped it open without sitting down. Julia leaned over his shoulder as he read the top page. Slowly, their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Then to something harder. What is this? He asked. Julia grabbed the second letter, scanning the contents. Is this? You're evicting us. I'm not evicting you, I said. The law is... Julia turned white, then red. You can't be serious. I nodded toward the documents. I'm entirely serious, and entirely within my rights. Matteo set the paper down like it burned him. Mama, this is our home. No, I replied, it's my home. You were guests. You took advantage of that. He looked stunned. Because of a joke at dinner? I laughed once, short and bitter. That was not a joke. That was the final crack in a wall you've been chipping at for years. Julia scoffed. You're being dramatic. No, Julia. I was dramatic when I painted the guest room lavender to match your wedding bouquet. I was dramatic when I labeled every cupboard for your organizational system. This, I tapped the letter, is restraint. Matteo sat down heavily on a stool. We have nowhere to go. You have plenty, I said. Friends, money, resources. You hosted a 12-person wine tasting 3 weeks ago. I'm sure one of them can help you relocate. Julia narrowed her eyes. What do you want from us? Nothing. That's the point. She turned to Matteo. She's gone senile. No, he said, his voice low now. She's just finally done pretending. He looked at me, and I saw it, the flicker of the boy I raised. The one who brought me violets in 2nd grade because he said they smelled like my aprons. The boy was still in there. But so was the man who let his wife mock me over arugula and balsamic. I stood. The notice gives you 30 days. I won't fight extensions if you ask respectfully, but I won't be ignored anymore. And I certainly won't be humiliated in my own house. Matteo nodded slowly. Understood. Julia stared at him. You're agreeing to this? He didn't answer. I walked back to the kitchen and poured the rest of my espresso into the sink. I didn't need to drink the rest. I'd already tasted what I needed. Silence that was mine, not granted. The rest of the day passed like an opera in slow motion. Julia slammed doors. Matteo disappeared into the study. I made lentil soup. At sunset, I climbed to the attic. My space, my sky-level haven. I opened the window wide, letting the golden air rush in, thick with dust and peace. I sat beside the planter box where I'd once taught Matteo how to grow basil. It still bloomed, quietly, faithfully. And I watched the city below as lights blinked on and someone sang across the alley, soft and off-key. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply breathed. For the first time in years, my breath felt like it belonged to me. I didn't expect the silence to be so loud. For 3 days, neither Matteo nor Julia spoke to me, beyond the bare minimum. Past the salt, mail came. The plumber called. No more brunch planning. No floral arrangements. No curated playlists for imaginary guests. Just the quiet ticking of a house, realizing it was no longer theirs. I went about my routines without adjusting for their moods. I brewed my espresso the old way, on the stove, not their automatic machine with the touchscreen. I cleaned only what I used. I stopped asking if anyone wanted leftovers. By the 4th morning, Julia's shoes were gone from the foyer rack. The Ferragamo's and suede heels she used to leave at angles, meant to be noticed. Her makeup mirror had vanished from the dining hutch too. The house began to look less like a showroom, and more like it used to. Lived in. Honest. Matteo lingered. He was a shadow of motion now, hovering near the kitchen entrance, offering to carry groceries I already held, setting 2 plates at dinner, even when I made only 1. He never brought up the eviction notice. But the way he hovered told me he was waiting for me to withdraw it. I wouldn't, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about pattern, and patterns only change when someone stops repeating them. That evening, as I was folding linens in the sunroom, Matteo stood in the doorway with a photo album in his hands. The navy blue one. My wedding album. I found this in the attic, he said. Didn't mean to snoop. You weren't snooping, I replied, laying a towel across the wicker chair. He sat across from me and opened it gently, like something sacred might fall out. I hadn't seen those pages in years. There we were, me in my silk veil, Alessandro's collar slightly askew, the basilica steps flooded with doves and cousins. He had hair like mine. Matteo said softly. Yes. I nodded. But he listened more. He smiled, despite himself. I remember him teaching me to polish shoes with the crust of old bread. That was his trick, said the starch, picked up shine better than wax. We sat in that golden quiet for a long time. I expected him to ask for forgiveness, for a second chance, a plea for time. Instead, he asked, "Do you think I failed you?" The question startled me, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. "I think," I said slowly, "you got used to me being smaller than I am." He nodded, eyes lowered. "I let Julia decide too much," he admitted. "It started small, paint colors, grocery lists, and then it became everything. You made choices too." He didn't argue. He closed the album and traced his fingers along the spine. "Are you really going to make us leave?" "I'm making space," I answered. "What you do with that space is your choice." He didn't reply. Later that night, I found a note taped to my bedroom door. It was written in Julia's loopy cursive, 4 sentences. I'll be out by next Friday. Please don't throw away the olive oil I bought. The good kind. Thank you for the linens. No apology, just inventory. By the following Tuesday, the house began to shift again. Boxes appeared in the foyer. The kind you order online when you're leaving somewhere you assumed you'd never have to leave. Matteo moved slower now. He paused more often. He stopped calling me Mama and started using my name. Elena. That morning, I found him sitting at the marble kitchen counter, a mug of black coffee untouched in front of him. I scheduled the moving van, he said without looking up. End of the month. I nodded. He glanced around the kitchen like it was the last time he'd see it.
You'll be okay.
I raised my espresso. I've always been okay. You just didn't notice. I do now, he said. Quiet. Ashamed. Awareness comes late for many, I said, sipping, but it still arrives. He stood slowly and placed something on the counter beside me. A single key. My house key. The one I gave him after his wedding, tied with a silver ribbon and a prayer card. I shouldn't have kept this, he said. I picked it up and ran my thumb over the worn teeth. No, but thank you for returning it. He lingered one more moment, then left the kitchen. I sat alone again. My espresso had gone lukewarm. Still, I drank it. That afternoon, I went through the cabinets. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Perhaps signs of my own erasure. There were none. No photos of me. No recipes in my handwriting. Not even my grandmother's spice tin, which had somehow been pushed to the far back of the top shelf behind Julia's imported herbs. I reached up, pulled it down, and held it close. Inside, bay leaves, dried rosemary, and a folded scrap of paper I hadn't seen in years. A note from Alessandro, written during his last month. Elena, whatever they take, let them. You already have what they'll never find, stillness in the storm. I traced his looping signature with my thumb. The wind shifted outside. I opened the back door and stepped into the small courtyard garden. Gilea's basil had wilted and the mint looked like it had given up. I knelt and pulled weeds with my bare hands, letting the soil crumble beneath my nails. I didn't care about appearances anymore. By sunset, I was seated once again at the marble counter. No music, no phone, just me and the steam curling from my cup. Julia passed through the hallway once fast, carrying packing tape and a furrowed brow. Matteo didn't appear. I didn't need them to. This was my quiet now, my countertop, my Rome. Not as it used to be, but as it would be again. The moving truck arrived 2 days earlier than expected. Julia barked orders in sharp Italian to 2 young men with tattoos on their necks and earbuds in their ears. They nodded, lifted boxes, and never asked questions. That, I noticed, was her specialty, delegating messes and pretending she hadn't made them. Matteo didn't help her pack. He spent most of the morning outside, standing in the courtyard like he might apologize to the garden if he stared at it long enough. From my perch at the marble counter, I watched the kitchen empty in stages. First, the copper mixing bowls, Alessandro once polished to a shine. Then the wine glasses, Julia said were too elegant for every day, which meant they were used 3 times in 8 years. Finally, the cookbook stand that used to hold my mother's handwritten recipes, now holding nothing. Not once did Julia meet my eyes, not when she pulled the drawer open and took my cake server, not when she packed the jar of saffron I'd kept for my birthday risotto. I said nothing. If I spoke, it would either be too little or far too much. Instead, I placed a letter on the counter and left it there. It was addressed to Matteo. I spent the rest of the afternoon upstairs, reorganizing my books by memory. The shelves were dusty, forgotten, just like the stories they held. I ran my fingers across the cracked spines of cookbooks, novels, an old catechism with my father's name scribbled inside the cover. That night, the house felt unfamiliar, the way it had when Alessandro died. Not empty, but changed. Like a room where someone had turned all the portraits to face the wall. I didn't sleep, not because of noise, because of knowing. The next morning, I came down to find the letter unopened. Still on the counter, beside a vase of wilted tulips, it hadn't moved. Matteo had seen it. He'd even set his espresso mug beside it, but he hadn't touched it. I walked into the garden instead. I trimmed the rosemary. I scattered breadcrumbs for the birds. I knelt beside the orange tree and picked up every fallen fruit, one by one. Their skins were soft, overripe, beginning to bruise. Still, I placed them gently into a woven basket. When I returned to the kitchen, the letter was gone. The vase was too. Matteo was standing at the sink, rinsing a plate that didn't belong to either of them. I read it, he said, not turning around. And I don't deserve your kindness. I took the espresso cup from the shelf and set it down quietly. Deserve has very little to do with kindness. He dried his hands and leaned against the counter. She wants to sue. I sipped my coffee. Of course she does. But she won't, he added quickly. I told her I wouldn't sign anything. I wouldn't testify. I wouldn't lie. That surprised me. I looked at him carefully, not as my son, but as a man learning the price of his silence. What changed? I asked. He shrugged. She thought I'd pick her over you. And? He looked away. For a long time I did. There it was. Not an apology. A reckoning. I don't want to come back here to visit, he added. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. That's fine, I said. I need to become someone who deserves to. By midday, the moving truck was gone. So was Julia. She didn't say goodbye, but she left a note taped to the front door. We're not done. I removed it without reading further. Inside, the rooms echoed. Footsteps didn't have to compete with music or phone calls anymore. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum softer, as if grateful for the quiet. I sat at the marble counter and placed the espresso cup on its saucer. Then I reached beneath the cabinet and retrieved a linen-wrapped bundle. Inside, my recipe notebook, the one I used to keep in the drawer, Julia filled with novelty tea towels and loose batteries. I opened to the first page. Pan al anais, my mother's handwriting, faded but firm. I traced the letters with the back of my nail. The margin still held her comment in blue ink. Only need when the radio plays something slow. I smiled. Then I flipped forward, past years of dishes, notes in Alessandro's handwriting, scribbled conversions Matteo once asked for. I stopped at the page I had bookmarked, with a pressed bay leaf. Torta del ritorno, a cake I made the day Alessandro came home from his last hospital stay. I hadn't made it since. I stood up. I found the eggs, the sugar, the jar of almond flour I'd bought last winter and hidden behind the lentils so Julia wouldn't try to replace it with her organic alternative. I cracked each egg gently, separating yolk from white with the edge of an old mug. My wrists still knew the motion. I baked. Not for anyone, not to impress, just to see what rose in the oven when silence was the only guest. As the scent filled the kitchen, I opened the kitchen windows. Sunlight struck the counter in angled stripes. The marble glowed, not the way Julia polished it for appearances, but how it looked when flour dusted the edges and espresso rings formed careless halos. When the timer rang, I didn't flinch. I moved slowly, intentionally, as I pulled the cake from the oven and placed it on the rack. I left it there to cool. Then I sat, and I breathed. The phone buzzed once beside me, a message from a number I knew but hadn't saved in years. Elena, I heard from Matteo. I don't know what to say, but I'd like to. If you ever want to meet Caterina, my sister's daughter. Julia had banned her from the house after a Christmas disagreement 6 years ago. I stared at the message. Then, for the first time in a long while, I typed back, "Come next Sunday. I'll make torta." Sunday arrived with the kind of morning sky Rome rarely offers, mottled gray, heavy with the promise of spring rain. It was the sort of weather Alessandro used to call tempo da torta cake weather, a sky that makes you reach for warm plates and stronger espresso. I polished the marble counter, not out of habit, but as a kind of welcome, not with harsh chemicals, just olive oil and vinegar, like my mother did. The linen napkins were ironed. A single vase held 3 fig leaves clipped from the courtyard tree. Caterina was due at 11. It had been 6 years and 2 months since I last saw her in person. That December, she had come with handmade candles for everyone. Julia told her they clashed with the aesthetic. No one else intervened. Caterina never returned after that. But she sent me letters, quiet ones. Birthday cards, newspaper clippings about local art shows, a sketch once of the villa's front door, drawn from memory. I kept them all tucked inside the recipe book, pressed flat between pages that still smelled faintly of vanilla and thyme. When the doorbell rang, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door before she could knock again. She stood there with a canvas tote slung over one shoulder and damp hair curling in soft waves from the drizzle. Her eyes, hazel, like her father's, widened at the sight of me. "Aunt Elena," she breathed. I took her hand without words and pulled her inside. We sat at the kitchen counter with 2 cups of espresso between us. The almond cake waited under a glass dome, uncut. A 3rd cup sat cooling nearby. A force of habit, I always poured one for Alessandro on Sundays. Katerina looked older, but not tired. She wore a navy wool coat, slightly frayed at one cuff, and her fingernails were chipped with faint traces of charcoal. Art still clung to her, even after all the years Julia had dismissed it. "I didn't think you'd write back," she said softly. I shrugged. "I wasn't ready before. Now I am." She traced her finger along a faint crack in the marble and glanced around the kitchen. "It looks different. It feels different." She nodded. For a while we just sipped. Rain began to streak the window behind us. Each drop a quiet percussion. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten," Katerina said after a pause. "Matteo never told me. I thought you were just distant." "I was," I replied, "but not by choice." She looked up. "Did she really try to sue you?" I smiled faintly. "Julia never liked to lose." "Neither do you," she said. "I don't mind losing," I said. "What I mind is being misnamed." Katerina tilted her head. "You mean, called the help?" I nodded. "It wasn't about pride," I explained. "It was about memory. A woman doesn't spend 50 years creating a home to be reduced to a convenience." She said nothing, but her hand found mine across the counter. A gentle squeeze, not pity, solidarity. We shared a slice of cake then, and for the first time in years, I ate without calculating someone else's needs. No portioning to please, no apologizing for sweetness. Just almond and warmth and family, the way it once was, the way it could be again. After lunch, Katerina walked me through her tote bag. Inside were small wrapped bundles, 2 herbal soaps she made, a bound notebook, a pencil sketch of the kitchen, and a folded envelope. "This one's yours," she said, sliding it toward me. I opened it to find an invitation to a gallery show, Katerina's work. "Mixed media, April. I'd like you to come," she said. "You were the first person who ever framed my art." I laughed. "That macaroni-shelled Madonna from your 3rd grade class still hangs in the pantry." She grinned. "I was 9. I thought it was profound." It was. We sat together for hours, making no plans, only promises. When she left, the drizzle had stopped. I stood in the doorway and watched her disappear into the curve of the alley, her coat flapping like a small sail. Inside, I returned to the counter and stared at the empty espresso cup across from mine. Then I rinsed them both and started to write. The first letter went to Lucia, my lawyer, a thank you for protecting my name when others tried to rewrite it. I included a small check as a gesture for the next woman who might need your help, but is too proud to ask. The second letter I didn't sign. It was addressed to the neighborhood association. I attached the foreclosure record from the deed Julia once tried to dismiss and asked them to update their files. Ownership, after all, should be accurate. The third letter stayed unwritten. Just an idea. For a community table, twice a month, open to those who lived in the area long before Airbnb and wine tours turned our block into a brochure. I would cook. Someone would read poetry. Perhaps Katerina could bring her sketchpad. This wasn't nostalgia, it was reclamation. That evening, I set one place at the kitchen counter, no centerpiece, no staging. I spooned lentils over toasted bread and added a drizzle of olive oil from the bottle Julia had left behind. She always said it was too expensive to waste on rustic food. She was wrong. Every bite tasted like punctuation. Final, firm, full of meaning. I didn't rush. I didn't scroll. I let the food cool between bites and let the quiet speak louder than any toast or speech ever had. Before bed, I walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows, brushing my hand across the wooden frames. Alessandro once sanded by hand. In the attic, the lamp flickered once and steadied. I left it on. In the kitchen, I turned off every light except the one above the stove. Then I sat one last time at the counter, just to remember. I used to say yes to everything because I feared being forgotten. Now, I say yes because I finally want to remember. It began with a flyer. Simple, black and white, posted on the bakery window 2 blocks from my villa. Courtier stories, Sunday reading circle, bring something, food, words or just yourself. There was no RSVP, no logo, just a time and a location, Piazza degli Artigiani, near the old olive press. I hadn't sat in a circle since before Julia came into our lives. She didn't believe in slow things. But slow was how I'd learned to braid dough, to steep broth, to raise a child. I missed that rhythm. I missed being seen as more than scenery. So I went. With my torta rustica still warm and wrapped in a linen cloth, I stepped into the square just after 10. The usual pigeons, scattered. A group of 9 or 10 people had already gathered, young and old. Some standing, some sitting on folding chairs they'd clearly brought from home. I didn't know a single face. That was the best part. No one asked where my son was. No one called me Senora M. No one apologized for forgetting to invite me. They just made space. A woman with silver rings on every finger smiled and motioned for me to sit. I placed the torta in the center of a makeshift table, really just 2 crates and a wooden plank, and took the seat beside her. Someone passed a thermos of coffee. Another handed me a small paper program with the name Giovanni circled in pen. He was the first to read a poem about losing his father in a summer storm. It was unpolished, beautiful, aching. Then came Francesca, who brought a photo of her grandmother's hands kneading pasta. She spoke about lineage like it was dough, tough. At first, soft with time. I listened, and then, without planning to, I spoke. I used to be the one who served food, I said. But only recently did I remember I can also serve presents. Silence. The good kind. Someone clapped. I hadn't realized my hands were shaking until I looked down and saw the folds of my napkin trembling like wings. Back home, the house felt less like a stage and more like a journal. Not tidy, but true. I left the windows open, let the wind move things. And I started to write again. Not legal letters, not family recipes, stories, real ones. Half memories, overheard phrases, small moments that once slipped through the cracks of larger events. One morning, I wrote a scene about a widow who planted herbs along the edge of a crumbling sidewalk. In the story, people began walking that way on purpose, just to smell the thyme and sage. It wasn't profound, but it was honest. I didn't realize I'd taped it to the fridge until Katerina came over the next Thursday and read it aloud without asking. "You wrote this?" she asked, eyes wide. I nodded. "Do you have more?" "Yes," I said. "I just never thought anyone would want them." "I want them," she said, "and so will others." A week later, she arrived with a battered leather folder. Inside were pages printed on creamy paper, the kind you don't waste on nothing. My name was on the cover, Elena Moretti. Fragment. "I printed a few," she said. "I thought maybe at the next reading circle." I stared at the folder like it might vanish. "You want me to read?" "I want you to be heard." That Sunday, I brought a basket of rosemary bread and the folder. The torta had been a peace offering. This was a stake in the ground. I read 2 stories, one about Alessandro's apron and how he sewed his initials inside. Another about a girl I once saw dancing barefoot near the Vatican walls during a blackout. They listened. They laughed in the right places. A woman named Marzia cried. And I felt something return to me. Not pride, not vindication, but weight. A kind of rootedness I'd forgotten belonged to me. Back at the villa, the silence had changed. It no longer echoed. It vibrated. The house felt alive, as if it had overheard the words I spoke in the piazza and approved. I made espresso just to hear it hiss. I left my cardigan draped over the chair and didn't rush to fold it. I stopped apologizing to myself for speaking aloud when no one else was home. One morning, I wrote a 3rd story about the dinner party, the one where they called me the help. I didn't make it a revenge tale. I made it about the scent of saffron and the exact moment I realized I'd stopped being invited and started being expected. It ended with a different kind of toast. To the ones who stay too quiet too long, and then remember their names. I didn't know if I'd read that one aloud, but I printed it anyway. Later that week, Matteo called. Not to argue, not to cry, just to ask how I was. I told him the truth. I'm busy being myself again. He was quiet for a long moment. Do you want to come see the new place? Not yet, I said, but thank you. He didn't sound hurt, just different. As if he finally understood I was not furniture to be moved, and returned when convenient. That evening, I sat at the marble counter with a fresh espresso and the leather folder open beside me. Outside, the courtyard glowed under the low sun. The rosemary bush had begun to bloom again, small, violet flowers like whispers. I placed a single blossom beside the espresso cup. Then I began to write the next story. I was folding linen napkins by the open kitchen window when I heard the front gate creak. It was unmistakable. The metal always groaned with a kind of long, judgmental sigh. Then, voices. Not loud, but close. A woman's tone clipped and cautious. A man's voice following in fragments. I didn't need to look. I poured the rest of my espresso into the sink, dried my hands, and sat down at the marble counter. If they were here, they would have to knock. They did. 3 sharp taps, not tentative, not familiar. When I opened the door, Julia stood beside Matteo like a marble statue just beginning to thaw. She wore a camel-colored coat and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Matteo held a small box under one arm and looked as though he'd aged 5 years since he last stood in this doorway. "Hello, Mama," he said. Julia didn't speak. "We won't stay long," he added quickly. She wanted to return something. I stepped aside wordlessly and let them in. The house was warm from the oven. I'd been baking semolina biscuits that morning. Alessandro's favorite, the smell filled the air, subtle but unmistakable. Julia handed me the box. "It's the family photo albums," she said, "from the hall cupboard." I realized I shouldn't have taken them. I took the box and placed it on the side table. "No," I replied evenly. "You shouldn't have." Matteo glanced around. I could see his eyes noting the changes, the folded laundry on the chair, the rosemary in the vase, the absence of anything that didn't belong to me. "You've made it yours again," he said softly. "It always was." Julia removed her sunglasses. Her eyes looked tired, not the kind that comes from lack of sleep, but from a life lived on constant alert. She smoothed her coat and looked toward the kitchen, where the espresso machine hissed softly. "Would you like coffee?" I asked, mostly to Matteo. He nodded. "Yes, please." Julia hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure." We sat around the marble counter, me in my usual seat, Matteo across, Julia diagonally, as if unsure whether to face me directly. I served their espresso in mismatched cups. Julia's had a faint chip on the rim. I left it there. No one spoke for a while. The biscuits sat between us, untouched. Then Matteo reached for one, broke it in half, and dipped it into his coffee like he used to as a boy. "I remember these," he said with a faint smile. "You used to make them after Nano's garden days." I nodded. He said they made his back hurt less. Julia cleared her throat. "I've been reading your stories," she said suddenly. That startled me. "How?" "Caterina," she answered. "She posts excerpts online, the one about the dinner party. I recognized the details." I said nothing. "I didn't realize how much it hurt you," she continued. "Or maybe I did, and I just didn't care at the time. Still," I said nothing. I wanted to be respected, and I thought control was the only way. Matteo's face flickered at that. Something like shame passed between them. "And now?" I asked calmly. She looked down. "Now I realize control and respect aren't the same thing. And I have neither." Her honesty, brittle as it was, didn't warm me. But it didn't anger me either. It just confirmed what I already knew. "You're not here to be forgiven," I said. "So don't act like it." She blinked. "Then what am I here for?" "To witness." Her brows furrowed. "You're here," I said, "to sit in the room you tried to silence, to see the version of me you tried to shrink. Not to fix it, just to witness it, fully." She stared at me, stunned. Matteo, to his credit, didn't interrupt. He sipped his coffee like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Caterina wants you to come speak at her gallery," he said quietly. "She says your words changed something in her." I allowed myself a small breath. She changed herself. I replied. She just needed a reminder. Julia pushed the biscuit plate an inch closer to me. A subtle offering. I don't expect you to ever trust me again, she said. I don't need to, I replied. I trust myself now, that's enough. When they left, Julia gave me a faint nod. Neither apology nor demand. Matteo kissed my cheek, like he used to before everything cracked. And then, I was alone again. Not lonely, just alone. I returned to the counter, where their cups sat with the faint rings of espresso on the saucers. I didn't rush to clean them. I let them sit as proof of what had transpired, not a reconciliation, but a reckoning. Then I picked up the pen and wrote the first line of a new story. It began like this. Some visitors come to be forgiven. Others come to see the wreckage they left and walk through it barefoot. I hadn't been inside a gallery in over 20 years. The last time was with Alessandro, when we took a train to Florence and wandered the Uffizi like tourists who knew they didn't belong but enjoyed pretending. We stood in front of Botticelli's Primavera for nearly 20 minutes, each pointing to a different figure as our favorite. This one, he whispered, gesturing to the barefoot woman stepping into the wind. She knows something no one else does. I didn't understand him then. I do now. Caterina's show was held in a renovated tobacco warehouse along the Tiber with skylights that washed the concrete walls in gold and shadow. I arrived early, habit, not nerves, and was greeted by the scent of turpentine and tulips. Caterina met me at the entrance with paint still under her fingernails and a look in her eyes that felt like both welcome and warning. You don't have to speak, she said quickly. Just be here. That's already enough. I'll speak, I replied, but only if the espresso's decent. She laughed and led me inside. The walls were lined with portraits, collages, fragments of cityscapes sewn into tapestries, memory made physical. At the far end of the gallery, a smaller alcove had been carved out for readings. 2 chairs, a microphone, and a stack of printed pamphlets titled Witnessing the Quiet Fragments by Elena Moretti. I froze. My name, bold and unhidden, no initials, no married title, just me. I didn't ask your permission, Caterina admitted, reading my expression. I just knew it needed to be seen. I reached out and touched the corner of the paper. It's strange, I said softly, seeing yourself hung like a painting. Strange? She asked. Strange and sacred. People arrived slowly, then all at once, neighbors, artists, students, even a priest from the nearby basilica who claimed he only came for the light but stayed for the stories. The room filled with soft chatter and clinking glasses. Someone passed me a small espresso in a porcelain cup, too delicate for a place like this, but perfect in its contrast. When it was time, Caterina introduced me with a few short words. This is my aunt, Elena, she said, voice clear but warm. She taught me how to frame a story long before I knew how to hold a brush. Tonight, she'll read a piece that changed how I look at silence. She stepped aside. I walked slowly to the chair. My loafers clicked against the gallery floor like punctuation. I sat, smoothed the page, and lifted my eyes. There was no need for preamble. I was called to help at my own dinner table, I began. But this is not a story about being insulted. It's a story about what I chose to serve in return. The room went still. I read with care, not performance. My voice didn't tremble. It flowed, steady and grounded. I told them about the chair they gave me without a cushion. The way my name was spoken like a footnote, the moment I realized that even my son had stopped listening. And then, I read the part that made the air shift. I left the room not in rage, but in ritual. I walked out with the silence of a woman who knows the difference between noise and voice. Someone near the back made a sound. Not quite a sob, not quite a gasp. I closed the piece with a single line. I served them their eviction notices, not from the house, but from my spirit. When I looked up, no one clapped. Not out of insult, but reverence. Then, slowly, hands came together. A low, thoughtful applause. Nothing performative, just weight meeting air. Afterward, a young woman approached me, eyes rimmed with tears. My mother, she was the help too, she said. In every room she walked into, even at home. I nodded. And what about now? She lives alone. But lately, she started painting again. Good, I said. Tell her some of us are still watching. Katerina joined me by the display wall, where a photograph of the villa's gate had been blown up in black and white. The caption read, "Thresholds reclaimed." "Do you want to take anything home?" she asked. I looked around. "No," I said, "it already came with me." Later that night, back in the kitchen, I poured myself a late espresso. Not because I needed the caffeine, but because I needed the ceremony. I sat at the marble counter, set the gallery pamphlet beside my notebook, and lit the candle Katerina had given me 6 Christmases ago, the one Julia had once called too rustic. Its scent filled the kitchen slowly, lavender and bay leaf. I didn't write that night. I just sat, one hand around the espresso, the other resting open beside the gallery program. And for the first time in years, I felt not just seen, but understood. I hadn't set foot in the upstairs guest room since Alessandro passed. For years, it remained a museum of abandonment, where folded towels sat untouched, the window barely cracked, and a porcelain bowl rested beside a bed that hadn't been slept in since before Matteo married. That room held a kind of silence I wasn't ready to disturb. Until this morning. After the gallery show, something inside me had shifted. It wasn't rage or pride, it was clarity. I was no longer living as someone bracing for unkindness. I was building a life rooted in choice. So I opened the door. Dust motes stirred in the sunbeam that pierced through the lace curtains. The room was dry but clean, stale in scent, not spirit. The walls were pale yellow, faintly cracked near the ceiling. A single photo remained on the dresser, me and Alessandro holding Matteo as a newborn, his face curled like a seashell. I took it down. The glass was cloudy, the frame cheap wood, painted to look like mahogany. Julia once called it the last humble thing in the house. I smiled and placed it gently in a drawer. The photo wasn't gone. It just didn't need to be on display anymore. This room wasn't for ghosts. It was for me. The transformation began with the curtains. I replaced them with linen drapes in olive green, not a trendy color, not neutral, but alive, like the grove behind my mother's childhood home. Next came the bedding, white cotton, soft but simple, with a throw blanket. Katerina had gifted me years ago. It had been packed away after Julia said it didn't match the tone of the house. I was done living in someone else's tone. I moved in a writing desk from the storage room and placed it near the window. Light pooled across the surface like warm milk. I lined the drawers with lavender sachets and tucked fresh paper beside my favorite pen. By the afternoon, the guest room was no longer a placeholder. It was a studio. Downstairs, I brewed espresso and carried it up carefully on a small ceramic tray with a biscotto nestled beside the cup. I set it on the corner of the desk and opened my note. The first story I wrote wasn't long. It was about a woman who opened a locked door and didn't find regret, but opportunity. She didn't move in haste. She didn't cry. She simply stood in the light and let it introduce her to herself again. I titled it, Afterward Came Color. Later that day, Katerina called. "They've invited you back," she said excitedly. "Another gallery, smaller, more intimate. They want a full reading." I didn't answer right away. "Nana?" she asked. "I'm here," I said. "Just thinking." She was quiet, respectful. "I don't know if I want to read again," I admitted. "That's okay," she replied. "You don't owe anyone performance. You've already given them presents." The phrase stayed with me long after we hung up. That night, I sat at the marble counter with the lamp dimmed low. Rain tapped the kitchen window, soft and persistent. I wasn't sad, just full, the way one feels after a meal, made exactly to their liking. I reached for a slip of paper from the fruit bowl. It was a grocery list I hadn't finished. I turned it over and began jotting a new list. Olive paint for hallway trim. Bookends for studio. More paper. Less apology. I smiled at the last line and underlined it twice. The next morning, I received a letter, not an email, not a message through Katerina, but an actual envelope with a wax seal. It came from Lucia, my lawyer. Inside was a final copy of the addendum to my will. Everything was as I had written months ago, with one addition I hadn't expected. A line in her handwriting, "Enclosed is your formal declaration of independence." I laughed aloud. Tucked behind the legal documents was a blank page. I stared at it for a long while before I brought it upstairs and placed it in the desk drawer. Every woman needs a blank page waiting for her. By noon, the sky had cleared. I opened every window on the upper floor and let the wind run through the house like a guest who knew exactly where to go. Papers fluttered but didn't fly. The lavender sachets held their ground. I brewed another espresso and carried it to the new studio. This time, I didn't write. I sat at the desk, looking out the window, watching the fig leaves tremble in the breeze. The courtyard was quiet, except for the soft hum of a bee drifting between blooms. In that moment, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel dismissed or forgotten. I felt placed exactly where I should be, no longer at the edge of someone else's life, but at the center of my own. The envelope arrived, tucked between a catalog and a gas bill. It was heavy, not just in weight, but in intention. Gold-trimmed, thick paper, addressed in Julia's unmistakably rigid handwriting. She never slanted her letters, as though emotion might cause the ink to spill sideways. I held it for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I opened it. Inside was a letter. Not an apology, not an invitation, a proposal, formal, almost clinical in tone. Julia and Matteo wanted to move back to Rome. They had found a new flat, but needed temporary lodging while it was being prepared. The villa, my villa, was listed as their preferred option. There was a clause at the bottom underlined once. We believe it would benefit the family to reconnect under shared space. Shared space. That was how she phrased it. I set the letter down beside my espresso and stared at the open kitchen window. The rosemary bush outside danced lightly in the wind, as if mocking the idea of anything forced into bloom. Later that day, I pulled out the lease agreement I had rewritten months ago. I drafted it for the tenants, now living in my old rental on Via della Cameli. A young couple with a newborn and no sense of guilt when they played music too loud on weekends. They paid on time. They left flowers on my doorstep. They called me Signora Elena, not help. I turned to a blank page and began writing a new document. Not a lease, a boundary. That evening, Caterina came over with a bottle of wine and a tote bag full of figs. "You look like someone who just saw a ghost," she said, placing the figs on the counter. "Not a ghost," I replied, an echo that wants the room back. She raised an eyebrow. I handed her the letter. She read it, silent at first, then gave a low whistle. "They really don't see you," she said. "No," I replied, "but I see myself now, and that's the problem." We drank the wine slowly, letting it breathe, letting ourselves breathe with it. Caterina asked if I was going to say no. "I'm going to say something better," I said. "I'm going to say here are the terms." The next morning, I walked down to my notary's office. Marcello was already sipping his cappuccino when I arrived. "You again," he said, grinning. "The woman who turned a family tree into a firewall." I smiled back. "I need one more line drawn." He took the letter, read it carefully, and nodded. "You want to draft a conditional rental agreement?" "Yes. But only for 30 days, and I want the final clause to read, 'Any violation of peace, respect, or ownership will be considered grounds for immediate termination.'" Marcello chuckled. "You want to turn civility into a clause. I want to make sure they understand this isn't a homecoming. It's a guest pass." By midday, I was back in the kitchen, reviewing the final copy of the contract. It was measured, fair, unmistakably clear, and it came with a price: rent to be paid, chores to be shared, rooms not to be entered without permission. It was not about punishment. It was about principle. I called Matteo that evening. He answered, on the third ring, his voice wary but calm. "Ciao, Mama." "I got your letter," I said. "I have a response." He waited. "I'm willing to open the door, but not the past, not the hierarchy, not the habits." "I understand," he said softly. "I'll send you a contract," I added. "If you both agree to the terms, you may stay for 1 month. After that, we reassess, and I expect full respect of every condition, including space." There was a pause. "Julia may not take that well." "I'm not writing it for her comfort," I replied. "I'm writing it for my peace." The next day, I returned to the courtyard. I hadn't pruned the ivy since spring. It had grown wild over the trellis, curling around the old iron bench that Alessandro once painted teal. I clipped slowly, intentionally. Each snip felt like a statement. When I finished, I swept the leaves into a basket and sat down with an espresso. The bench was warm from the sun. The ivy, trimmed, still danced. I imagined them arriving again, bags in hand, That look Julia wore like perfume, tight, measured, expensive, Matteo trying to soften her edges like a stone, rolling uphill. But this time, I wouldn't be the background. I would be the border. I returned to the kitchen and placed the signed contract in an envelope. On the outside, I wrote just 2 words. Terms enclosed. It was not an invitation. It was a reminder. The doorbell rang precisely at 9:00 a.m. Not early, not late, right on time. Like a scheduled delivery. I was already dressed, pale slate blouse, soft trousers, and the gold pin Katerina gave me the day I filed the first deed in my name alone. A small gesture of permanence. I didn't rush to the door. Let them wait 1 minute. When I finally opened it, Julia stood there in polished ankle boots, lips pursed like she was bracing for the smell of old laundry. Matteo held 2 suitcases, a duffel, and what looked like a houseplant already drooping in protest. Buongiorno, I said evenly. Good morning, Julia replied, with the tone one might use when greeting a customs officer. Matteo smiled faintly. Hi, Mama. I trust you've read the agreement. Julia's jaw tightened. Yes. And you agree to every condition? We signed, didn't we? That's not what I asked. Matteo stepped in. We agree. I held the door open. They entered slowly, not with reverence, but with tension, like actors stepping into a set where the director had changed the script. I had. Their room was upstairs. I led them there without offering help. The guest room had been prepared neutrally. White linens, 2 towels folded with the same care I once reserved for family I trusted. There's no housekeeping, I said plainly. You clean up after yourselves. Matteo nodded. Of course. And breakfast is at your own discretion. This isn't a hotel. Understood. Julia looked around the room like it had failed some unspoken standard. She touched the nightstand as if checking for dust, and found none. Sheets are clean, I said, eyes locked on hers. But if you prefer a different thread count, I'm sure a hotel down the street can accommodate. Matteo glanced quickly at her, warning her not to start. To my surprise, she said nothing. Back downstairs, I returned to the marble counter where my espresso still steamed faintly. I didn't sip it right away. I wanted them to hear the quiet of the kitchen, the rhythm of a house now run by dignity, not obligation. Julia came in first, smoothing her blouse, as if to reassert order. This is different, she said. I expected something colder. I raised an eyebrow. Why would it be cold? Well, she started, given everything. This house was cold, I said, when warmth was expected without thanks. It's not cold now, it's just honest. She didn't respond. I gestured to the espresso machine. You know how to use it? I do. Good! Feel free to make your own. Matteo joined a few minutes later. He didn't sit, just leaned against the counter, holding the edge like a man gripping the side of a boat. You've changed things, he said. I've corrected things, I replied. He looked down, then at me. I want to help, if you'll let me. I nodded. The rosemary needs trimming, and the pantry's due for inventory. Start there. There was no gratitude exchanged, just clarity. It felt cleaner than thank you. That afternoon, I stayed in the studio. The upstairs was silent, save for the occasional creak of floorboards. Unspoken reminders that presence does not equal welcome. I wrote a short passage titled, Living with Ghosts. You Don't Mourn. It was more of a note than a story, but I gave it structure anyway. I wrote, They walk softly, unsure if they're allowed to be loud. You let them. But you do not invite echoes. At dinner, I made soup, nothing fancy, lentils, carrot, some thyme. I served it with bread left over from the bakery. No candles, no place settings, just 3 bowls on the counter. Julia came in, looked at the setup, then quietly reached for the ladle. I'll serve us, she offered. Matteo brought water to the table without being asked. We sat, we ate. No one mentioned the past. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't performance either. It was simply presence. After the dishes were washed by them, I returned to the kitchen and poured myself an espresso. I leaned against the marble counter and exhaled. Not from exhaustion, but calibration. The house had not been disrupted. I had not been displaced. And that was the quietest victory of all. 3 days into their stay, Julia announced she wanted to give something back. I'd like to host a dinner, she said, stirring her cappuccino with a silver spoon she brought herself, as if my kitchenware might contaminate the flavor. I looked up from my writing notebook. Here, yes, small, just a few friends, some of Mateo's old colleagues. A celebration of sorts. Celebrating? What, exactly? She faltered. New beginnings, rebuilding bridges, rehearsed words, the kind you find in self-help books or legal settlements. Mateo looked uneasy, but stayed silent. I let the air sit for a moment, before I answered. Fine. One evening, one dinner. But I won't be catering. And I won't be invisible. Her smile stiffened. Of course not. The preparations began immediately. She ordered flowers from a boutique in Trastevere and linens online that didn't match a single thing in my dining room. She instructed Mateo to polish the silverware, which hadn't been used since Alessandro's 70th birthday. She told me, without irony, that I could take the night off if I preferred. From my own house? I asked. Her lips parted, but no words emerged. I continued. You may be hosting, but I am present. I left her to marinate in that sentence. The night arrived with Roman ease, dusky orange skies, the clink of bottles in carrier bags, and the shuffling sound of people trying to remember how to behave formally. There were 6 guests in total, 2 sharp-suited men from Mateo's old accounting firm, a well-dressed couple who complimented the wine before tasting it, and a woman with lacquered fingernails who addressed me as madam like she was in a hotel lobby. Julia wore her intention, like perfume too much, too strong. Mateo looked like he wanted to evaporate into his wine glass. I wore a navy blue dress Katerina had tailored for me last Christmas. Not dramatic, not humble, just exact. The first moment of friction came with the seating. Julia had arranged the table with place cards. Hers was at the head, Mateo at the opposite end. I was placed along the side, closest to the kitchen. I picked up my card, studied it, then calmly walked around the table and placed it at the center seat, across from the window, directly in the middle. Actually, I said, this chair will do. Everyone watched. Julia hesitated, but said nothing. The woman with the lacquered nails gave a small approving nod. The dinner began politely. Wine flowed. Plates passed. Julia introduced each dish as if she had cooked it herself, though I had seen the boxes arrive from a catering service that morning. Mateo offered short anecdotes, none personal. The guests laughed at appropriate intervals. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The woman with the red nails, her name was Paula, asked, So Signora Elena, do you still keep the place up on your own? That's quite impressive for someone who once helped out in the kitchen. I sipped my wine, placed the glass gently down, and smiled. I didn't help, I said softly. I hosted, I built this home. Every brick of it, while others took credit. I preserved it when everyone else was too busy living elsewhere. And I am not the help. I am the foundation. The table fell into silence. Paola blinked. Of course I meant no offense. You simply mirrored what you were told, I said. But mirrors break, and truths remain. Mateo coughed lightly. Julia reached for the wine and missed the glass rim slightly, spilling a drop on the linen she had ordered so carefully. No one dared mention it. Dessert came. I didn't eat it. Instead, I excused myself and returned moments later with a silver tray holding 3 envelopes. I handed one to Mateo, one to Julia, and one to the empty seat beside me. Symbolic. The guest who had once called me a ghost at my own table wasn't here tonight, but his absence deserved its own address. Julia looked at the envelope like it might be poisonous. What is this? Your departure documents, I said. Her face flushed. What do you mean? The contract ends in 4 days. You will not be renewing. This is formal notice. Paola tried to interject. Is this real? As real as this house, I replied, which no longer pretends to welcome what wounds it. Mateo opened his envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet. Written in my own hand, a house is not a stage. I will not act for anyone again. After the guests left, there were no words. Julia stomped upstairs like a disappointed diplomat. Mateo lingered. You didn't have to do it that way, he said quietly. Yes, I said. I did. Why? Because I was once made small here. I had to become visible in front of the very eyes that refused to see me. He nodded. You were brilliant. I placed my hand on his shoulder. It wasn't brilliance, it was truth. And I finally gave it a seat. On the morning of their departure, the house felt still, but not silent. It had the sound of decisions closing behind them, of unsaid words that no longer needed space. I woke early. The light was soft, slanting sideways through the shutters. I didn't hear movement upstairs. For once, no clinking of Julia's bangles or the low hum of Matteo's morning phone calls, just the creak of my own slippers on the tiles as I made my way to the kitchen. I brewed a single espresso and let it rest beside me on the marble countertop. The kitchen, for all its uses, had never looked more mine. Then I reached for the wooden box I had tucked away on the highest shelf of the pantry, a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were keepsakes, the lace handkerchief my mother gave me before my wedding, a faded letter from Alessandro folded into fourths, and a photo of Matteo as a child, sitting on my lap, being. Not everything in life stays unchanged. But that didn't mean it had to be discarded. I took out the photo and set it on the counter. By 10 a.m., Julia descended with her suitcase already zipped and upright. She wore sunglasses indoors, a sign she was not in the mood to make eye contact. Matteo followed closely behind, carrying the plant, now more wilted than ever, and a smaller bag slung over one shoulder. "Your taxi's waiting," I said, motioning toward the window. "We figured," Julia said curtly. Matteo hesitated. "Do you want us to leave a key?" "No, the locks were changed this morning." Her head snapped toward me. "Seriously?" I met her gaze evenly. "Seriously." There was no ceremony to it. No argument. No tearful exchange. She nodded once, more out of disbelief than agreement, and turned toward the door. But Matteo stayed behind. "I'd like to speak with you, alone," he said. Julia's sigh was audible, but wordless. She walked out without glancing back. We stood in the hallway, two shadows thrown by the same sun, shaped by different seasons. "I know I failed you," he began. "Not just now, over years. I saw how they treated you and said nothing." I didn't interrupt. He continued, his voice tight. "I thought I was keeping peace by staying neutral, but neutrality is just cowardice in a prettier suit." I reached for his hand, not to forgive, but to affirm that I heard him. "What matters now," I said, "is what you choose to be next. Not for me, for yourself." "I want to visit," he said, "not stay. Just visit." "You'll be welcome," I said, "as long as you knock." His eyes welled slightly, but no tears fell. He turned to go, then stopped. "Oh, I almost forgot." He pulled something from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. It was the envelope I had given him at the dinner, still sealed. "I couldn't open it then," he said. "I think I can now." After he left, I didn't move right away. The house exhaled, its walls uncurled. It felt like taking off shoes that had always pinched, but you only realized after the pain was gone. I returned to the marble counter, picked up the espresso, now slightly cooled, and sipped slowly. Then I opened the notebook from my studio and wrote the final entry for that chapter. The door they closed was mine, but the handle? That was always in my hand. That afternoon, Caterina visited. She brought biscotti and a newspaper with my name highlighted in a small column. Someone at the gallery had written a follow-up review. "Your voice," it read, "is not only heard, it lingers." We sat at the counter, breaking biscotti in half, dipping it in coffee. "You look different," she said. "I feel placed," I replied. Caterina smiled. "You served them their notices, but you gave yourself the home." "No," I said, tapping her hand gently. "I reclaimed it." Before she left, Caterina asked, "Are you going to the next gallery event?" "I might," I said, "but I'm not bringing any old pain with me." She nodded. "Good. It doesn't match your walls anymore." That night, I lit a candle in the courtyard. Not for memory, not for mourning, but for the space now made sacred by refusal. I whispered 3 names, not aloud, just in thought. Alessandro, my younger self, and the woman who had once been mistaken for furniture in her own home. Then I blew the candle out, and for the first time, the dark didn't feel like absence. It felt like rest.